very pleased to host Stephan Meier today. He's going to present a paper with Maria and Robert, so we are very pleased also to have them on board. So Stephan is a behavioral economist, but he's very interested in many different issues. So it's, if I have to define very quickly Stephan, I mean, he's interested by issues like social norms, trust, in-group favoritism, and basically he has applied that to different fields, labor economics, poverty, monetary incentives. And today he's going to talk about collective attitude and collective opinion about immigration in relationship with the business cycle, if I'm not mistaken. So we are very, very happy to have Stephan on board. And now, Stephan, I'm going to give you the floor. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Michel, for this way too nice introduction and for inviting me, and then for Simone for organizing all the logistics behind it. Very professional. So as Michel said, Maria Cotofan from LSE and Robert Doer from Rotterdam, who are my co-authors on that paper, are also on the call. So this is a relative preliminary project and paper. We're actually finishing the draft. So any comments about it are more than welcome. I think none of us are like real experts in immigration, so we're coming from a different angle to that topic. So this is in particular, so if you have comments about like we're missing something about immigration or literature and whatever, please send comment to me. The email is here, or to Maria or to Robert. So let me start with some motivation. I think we're experiencing right now like a worldwide recession, and it's probably going to be, if anything, worse going forward or not. So if you look at the unemployment rate in the US, which went down a little bit, but it's still in October about 8 percentage points, and might have actually increase more if this second wave like hits pretty hard. So the question we are interested in, whether this experience of a recession or like different macroeconomic conditions affect people's attitude, and in particular whether this experience affect compassion or other regarding preferences. Meaning, does that affect how we think about other people around us? Do we help them more? How do we think about their feelings and needs? Now, this is a literature that goes back and relates to a literature that goes back to the finding that those macroeconomic conditions during impressionable years, that's between 18 and 25, actually have persistent impact on people's attitudes and preferences for life. So how we experience when we're relatively young kind of shapes how our attitudes are forward. This is some literature in economics, most importantly in psychology and development psychology, looks at those impressionable years and that a lot of attitudes are shaped then. This might also tell us something about how and when those pro-social preferences are actually shaped. So we see differences in how people think about compassion and other regarding preferences, and maybe those different experience but shared among like some cohorts actually affect how people think about this. Now, when you look at the previous literature, there is on this question, whether those experience, let's say a recession affect compassion, some research actually support a very optimistic view. Most importantly, there is the seminal paper by Giuliano and Spilimbergo in the Review of Economic Studies, who looks at whether growing up in a recession has any impact on preferences for redistribution. And it actually does. So if you experience a recession or you grow up in bad macroeconomic times, it looks like people are more likely to vote or in favor of redistribution. They're more likely to vote for left-wing parties. And if you ask them whether success in life is determined by luck or by effort, a determinant for redistributional preferences, people who grow up in a recession are more likely to say that success in life is shaped by luck. In psychology, there is more of those more optimistic view that like growing up in a recession makes people less narcissistic, a little less individualistic. And based on that research, you might be tempted to answer the question before that, like growing up in a recession actually makes you more compassionate. However, there is another type of literature that shows a little bit more pessimistic view. So Maria, Robert, and myself, in collaboration with Leah Kassar, show that growing up in bad economic conditions actually makes you care about income more than meaning, which you could potentially interpret that it makes people a little bit more selfish. There is also a famous argument by Benjamin Friedman, who talks about moral concepts of growth, which says like, well, if there is only in growth periods or when you experience like good macroeconomic conditions, you can be more moral, and if not, when there is more recessions, actually some of those moral considerations go down. And last but not least, there is some research on that, you know, over the business cycle, attitudes against outgroup members actually are shaped. When the economy is not doing well, then outgroup attitudes is going down. So that might need now shapes kind of how we thought about, after we saw this literature, how we thought about how that could be potentially reconciled. So we wanted to ask in that paper, how universal is that presumably compassion due to experience recession? And we're going to do this focus on like one particular type of outgroup, which is immigrants. So we're going to look at whether the experience during macroeconomic conditions during those oppressional years actually affect attitudes towards immigration. Now, while we do think we are the first ones who actually look at this experience on those attitudes for immigration years later, we are of course not the only one who look at how macroeconomic conditions affect attitudes towards immigrants. Most of the literature we could find, at least, are like theories or papers about like how concurrent macroeconomic conditions affect attitudes towards immigrants. I think one very prominent one is what we had, how we labeled it here as the labor market competition theory. Meaning that like if competition for jobs or government transfers increase, that affects negatively attitudes towards immigrants. Now, recession intensified that competition, or at least the perception of like that recessions actually affect those competition, especially for unskilled workers in richer countries. Now, that's kind of the theoretical backbone for like that recessions over the business cycle that affects kind of attitudes towards immigration. And if we're going into a recession, then people get more, especially unskilled workers, get more critical about immigration. However, empirically, there is like mixed results. Some papers can confirm it, some cannot. And in addition, there is still like large individual heterogeneity. We want to say something about those heterogeneity, but having those labor market competition theory kind of in the back of our minds. Now, when you think then about what we would like to contribute to our paper, before I then go into the empirics of what we're actually doing, is like we want to say something about attitudes towards immigrants. We want to make a contribution, and here your comments are particularly welcome. You know, we think like that we can show for the first time that those attitudes towards immigration are shaped when people are young, and those macroeconomic conditions can have long-term consequences for how people think about immigration. This might explain the heterogeneity between people, because it's kind of those cohorts that get hit and have those shared experiences that then affect kind of how they think about immigration. And that might potentially be a support kind of indirectly through like those labor market competition theory, that when competition increases, so when the economy tanks, that kind of shapes those attitudes going forward. I think we also want to say something about like how redistribution, and that's the paper by Giuliano and Spilimbergo, showed like recessions actually make people more likely to vote for redistribution, that redistribution and immigration are kind of linked. We're not the first one, of course, to claim that. There is a large and relatively growing literature that redistribution and immigration kind of goes together. But we want to say something about that. Both are kind of shaped by the experience when young. Now that starts you to interpret the results in Giuliano and Spilimbergo slightly differently, so that people, if growing up in a recession, prefer more redistribution, might be more selfish than compassionate, because they want to increase redistribution, but in order to make that something that is for them, they need to exclude the poor immigrants who might come in and compete for jobs or for government transfer that they increase. I think last but not least, you know, as Michel talked about, I work quite a bit on like in-group preferences and parochialism, and we can show, and I'm going to show you this later, that this not only affects kind of attitudes towards immigrants, but to outgroup members in more generally. And so we can say something about how those experiences when young actually lead endogenously those changes in preferences slash attitudes. Okay, so with that now, I'm moving forward to the empirical approach. So what we want to do, what we're doing is we're using two data sets that look at this particular question. One is a US data set, the General Social Survey. It's a repeated cross-section survey that in total got administered for about 30 years, since 72, not every single year, but like about 30 waves. And then the other one is repeated cross-country survey, the World Value Survey. That is so far about 6 waves in approximately 100 countries. So the empirical approach then basically, and I'm going to go into more details in just a slide or two, is what is the main effect of experience, income, and immigration attitudes? And I'm going to show you how we deal with some challenges, empirical challenges that are obvious when you think about that. We then are going to look at subgroup analysis as well. So I want to take this theories which talk about low and high skilled workers very seriously. So we split the sample into low and high income, high and low skills. We proxy it by education, either by own or by education of your parent. And then for the World Value Survey, we look at not just immigration, but actually expanded to more general in-group bias to see whether how much of this is really targeted against immigrants or against other groups that are different from the native. So let me start with what we're going to talk about in terms of how we measure those attitudes towards immigration. This is now from the General Social Survey, and the question we're looking at as you know, do you think that the number of immigrants to America nowadays should be and then increased a lot to reduced a lot? This is going to be a 5-point scale, and we're going to label that variable that you're going to see in anti-immigration. Higher scales mean you're in favor of immigration, and lower scales mean you're against immigration. We're going to have 10 waves between 94 and 2016 that question is going to be asked. So that's what we're going to focus on. Now, as you can imagine, then we want to go back in time, you know, because we want to capture the experience that people had when they, let's say somebody answers in 94. We want to look back then in time. What was the macroeconomic condition when that particular responders in 94 was between 18 and 25? Now, as you can imagine, one of the main empirical challenges that we're going to address is that if we just use cross-time variance, those cohorts share, of course, many experiences. So again, there is a responders in 94. Let's say that person was 50 in 94, then we will go back more than 30 years, look at what their experience is in the time when he or she was 18 to 25, and then look at what effect that had on responding in 94. Now, the problem is like everybody who is 50 in 94, and we're going to go back, shares, of course, many experiences when they're 18 and 25 that are the same. So how we identify it, and here, this is not an innovation we did. We follow that paper in the Review of Economic Studies. We use regional variation in macroeconomic condition during those impressionable years. So that allows us to control for time invariant common shocks that hit one of those cohorts. There's like technology, global, national shocks that affect those 50-year-old when they were 18 to 25. In addition, you know, we control then for year fixed effect. So 94 is—
Stephan, sorry.
Yes.
Just one question. So it also means that you have information on the past place of residence of individuals, or you assume that they were living where they are observed at the time of the survey?
Yeah, Simon, that's a great question. So I will talk a lot about it as well, but I can address it right now. So we actually know in the General Social Survey, we know where they lived when they were 16. So we know, and we're going to use then the macroeconomic condition in that region where that responders lived at the age of 16. Now, it's possible that they moved. Now, 16 is not 18 to 25 as well. So we're going to do a couple of things to address this with that not perfectly data that we have. So we look, for example, at whether the effects differ between people who moved between 18 and now. And we can show that even for those who still live in Minnesota, they lived in Minnesota in 18 or in the northeast when they were 16 and still live now when they're then 50, and the effects are exactly the same than people who actually move.
Thanks.
Now, in the end, what we're going to do then is like we look at those attitudes about immigration, and the most important variable then we look at those income levels between 18 and 25. This is on those regions that they reside at the age of 16, and we look how was the macroeconomy, the average. We look at real income per capita during those impressionable years between 18 and 25 and take a simple average over those periods. So for each individual, we then calculate what is their experienced income level between the 18 and 25. Now we use GDP per capita or not unemployment, for example, because there isn't any data that goes back for unemployment on the state level. We have unemployment rates.
Stephan, a quick question from Johan Monras. Just a question about why between 18 and 25. Is it because these are the typical years during which preferences are formed by individuals?
Yeah, good, great question. So the psychology literature tells us that those 18 to 25 are kind of important years where those preferences are shaped. Now, they're of course relatively arbitrary. Why not 9 to 5? In fact, I'm going to show you later that we're going to look at also different years, whether it's really those 18 and 25 that shape it, or whether it's more like 26 to 30, different buckets that affect kind of those preferences. Now, what is interesting and what is also important, 18 to 25, while the psychologists say these are the impressionable years, for an economist, of course, those are also the years where we enter the labor market, or a lot of people enter the labor market. Now, we know there is, of course, a large literature that shows, entering the labor market in different macroeconomic conditions has consequences for your lifetime income. That has consequences for your educational level. That has consequences on your labor market status years later. So I'm going to show you also all the regressions we're having control very carefully for those outcome variables years later. We also exclude them. I'm going to show you regressions with and without those endogenous variables that might be affected by the labor market entry years, which turn out to be almost the same as 18 and 25. It could also be because you entered the labor market between 18 and 25, those are a little bit more impressionable than years later. I'm going to show you also, whether they decay over time. So there's like the 18 to 25 years, the macroeconomic condition. Is it for somebody who is now 50 or even older, does those experience 25 years earlier still affect their preferences? And they do. So this is the income level at 18 to 25. And as I said, I'm going to show you also other age brackets to see whether those 18 and 25 is really special or not. Then we have a bunch of controls, like a lot of social demographics and demographic variables, gender, race, then there is education, immigration status of parents, and so on and so forth. Then we control for kind of the year fixed effect. So what year did the survey take place? Then we look at the region of interview fixed effect. So where they live right now, the region at age 16 fixed effect to have like, is there some Southeast effect? And we also control for a limited number of cohort dummies to just make sure that there is not this perfect collinearity between the age cohort and time. So let me now turn to any questions about the regression. So we're using attitudes towards immigration, as I showed you before. And then we calculate for each individual, what was the income level between 18 and 25 in the region when they're 16. So we exploit kind of differences across regions. And then we control for all those social demographics, we control for time now, and all those other fixed effects which capture kind of in time invariant region and year fixed effect.
Yeah, regarding the regression, Stephan, just a small uncertainty. Is it individual specific, the income level, or is it region specific?
It's region specific.
Okay.
So while it's region specific, now we also control for, as you see here, we control for your personal income level right now. So again, you're 50 in 94. So we look at what is your household income in 94. We also look at what was your household income at the age of 16. So going back on the individual level, but the income level is on the regional level income level. So everybody who is 50 in 94, who grew up in the southeast of the United States, has the same income level for that region. But then we compare that for a 50-year-old who lives in the northeast at the same time, controlling for everything else. Michel, does that?
Yes,
answer?
yes, I was just reflecting some discussion
Sure.
in the chat. So, but thank you very much. Yes, that's clear.
Perfect. So here's another results that we get. This is the main results from the general social surveys. The two columns again is one is with all control variables included, and the second column on the right excludes kind of those more endogenous variables that could be or are probably affected by like labor market entry in good or bad times, so household income, years of education, or the labor market status today. Now, there is no difference between the two, but I always show you kind of with or without, or most of the time with and without. Now, what you see here is like if the income level is higher when you're 18 to 25, the attitudes towards immigration is more positive. So anti-immigration attitudes is going to go down. So that's how you have to interpret the results right now. Now, just to say something about the size of effect, we actually think this is quite a sizable effect. So if you double the income level at 18 to 25, that leads to this 0.4 less immigration on this 5-point scale. So just to put that in perspective so that you can see how to think about this, you know, doubling of your current household income is about 0.013. So people with higher household income are also less anti-immigration, but the effect of like the experience that you have, we think is higher. It's about 75% of the effect of both parents being immigrants. Again, this is of course, if both parents are immigrant, you're less anti-immigration. And our effect of the doubling of income is about 75% of that effect of both parents being immigrants to the US. Now, one question is then, you know, and I alluded to it a little bit before already, does that effect decay with age? So the more you get away from that 18 to 25 experience, does that effect of this experience decay over time? So what we're doing is we're estimating the effect of those income levels at 18 to 25 and then interacting with the different age groups to see when people got older, saying whenever those 18 to impressionable years are further away from right now, does the effect get smaller? And the answer is no. So column 1 and 2 I showed you before already, so those are the same. And now column 3 just adds those interaction effect with 2 older age cohorts. So this is 26 to 50 and 51 to 75. And you see the effect of those income levels at 18 to 25 are not decaying over time. Now, there are a bunch of robustness tests. I'm only going to show you a couple of them, but I'm going to walk you through some. So there are a lot of other ways of like proxy for income indicators. So one is in the main analysis, we look at average experienced income level between 18 and 25. You might wonder, maybe the variance, so how much it actually fluctuates matters. So we control for the variance of this experienced income level between 18 and 25 doesn't have an impact on our estimation. We look at income level in the current region, that also doesn't affect our income level. We create the recession indicator similar to Giuliano and Spilimbergo that has a very similar effect to what we find with income level. We can look at national unemployment rate. I mentioned before, we use regional GDP per capita because there is no unemployment data on regional levels prior to 76. But we, of course, have unemployment data until starting in the 1920s. But on the national level, if you just take the national experienced unemployment rate between 18 and 95 on the national level, now, of course, it gets identified by like your birth cohort. We find a similar effect. Something you might be interested in, because a lot of you work on immigration, is like we can also look at immigration flows. You know, it's possible, of course, that like those recession also affect kind of how many people enter the US as immigrants. So what we did here, we did also the experienced immigration inflows. So we calculated for each individual between 18 and 25, how many immigrants entered the US. And then we divided those experience into quartiles. So where you're at the bottom or the top quartile and how many immigrants came in. And you see here very similar to a lot of papers who show that, you know, of course, more immigrants coming in kind of affects how the attitudes in a predicted way. So if you're in the top quartile and how many you experience larger immigration inflows affects your attitudes. Quarter is like on the bottom, you become less anti-immigration, but our income level at 18 to 25 is not affected by this.
Sorry, Stephan, just a question on this table, which is related to, I think, a point that Joan Moras was raising in the question. Here, the type of variability that you exploit is different, because for income condition, it is across regions, while here it's a story. Why don't you do the same, in a sense, on both fronts?
Yeah, I don't think, Maria, maybe you can. I don't think we have immigration inflows by those regions, or.
Sorry, I was just answering some things in the Q&A. So the question is about immigration inflows at the region level. Yeah, so I think unfortunately we only have national data on immigration that goes back to the 1920s. I think regional data or the state level, it's a very recent phenomenon in the US. But if anyone knows of some databases that might be useful here, would be very helpful.
Yeah. I mean, Simona, you're absolutely right. Whoever asked the question, ideally you want to have that on the regional level as well. But if you, as Maria said, if you have like any data, if you know of any data sources that allows us to do that, that would be fantastic.
Thanks.
So then let's move on. So we also have like other age periods. So we look at, you know, 0 to 9, 9 to 18, and so forth and so on. And in most of the specification, those 18 to 20 years really seem to be special in that the experience there is what drives those attitudes. So now there are those heterogeneous effects. You know, how is more affected by those experiences? Now we split people into low and high skill based on their parents or their own experience. And what you see here is very similar regressions that you showed you before, but we now look at, you know, low education, so a median split below median levels of education or high education. So the first two are for your own education, and then the second two are for the father's education. And what you see across the board is the effects of those income is much more pronounced for people who have either low education themselves or their father has like low education or as a proxy for like low skills. So just to summarize kind of the GSS, those regional income levels during impressionable years affect those anti-immigration attitudes. The lower skills worker are most affected by those macroeconomic conditions. Now, the World Value Survey, and here it goes now a little faster because it's basically the same, but just on a global scale. So we're using two questions here. So one is very similar to the one before. How about people from other countries coming here? Should they let everybody in, and so forth? So that's a 4-point scale. Or then there is another question which we use, you know, when jobs are scarce, employers should give priority to national than immigrants. This is the dummy where we create when they agreed or not. The regression now is very similar. We're also going to show you between rich and poor countries. So rich countries is going to be OECD countries before 98, excluding Turkey, which is very different really in their developmental level, and most other government agencies don't count them as quote unquote rich. And then we calculate for each individual now on the country level, those GDP per capita during impressionable years. The regressions are then very, very similar. Attitudes, the income level between 18 and 25 on the country level now, not the region. So this is across the globe, controlling for most of the things that we know also in the GSS. The effects now or we can replicate this in the World Value Survey as well. So higher income level, this is column 1, leads to less likely to be restrictive on immigration, less likely to give priority to natives over immigrants. In the column 2 or 4, we did the same on like how much does that decay with age, and there doesn't seem to be much decay with age as well. We do similar levels of robustness tests, other income indicators, standard deviation of income, current income. There is no effect that affects our results, and other age groups as well. So we're going to find the same as in the GSS. We do now a couple of additional analysis, which I want to walk you through quickly. One is by the development level. Is this mainly rich countries or poor? And then also by skill level, as we did before. Is it within rich countries, mainly they're low or high educated, and so on? And at the end, I want to say something about in-group mentality more broadly. So this is now the same regression as before, but we split in column 1 and 2. So this is immigration restriction as the outcome variable by rich and the poor, and the same for the native priority. And what you see, at least directionally, is there are more people, more observation in the rest of the world than in those OECD countries. But looking at the size of the effects, it seems like that it's mainly in richer countries which drive our results. So the effects are much stronger within those rich OECD countries than not. If you then split it up between rich and low education, LE, or high education, for immigration restrictions, again, it shows like similar to GSS, that it's more like the low educated where the effects are driven. If you look at the coefficients here, it is, the point estimates show a little bit at the low, but it's actually becoming a little less clear that it's really in the low educated in richer countries that drive that results. If you look at our other variable, native priority, it gets even less clear whether it's really so clear that it's the low educated or the low skilled workers which drive the low skilled worker that drive that result. Sometimes it actually flips the result as well. So this is just to summarize what I just said. Now, is that only for immigration and immigrants? So as I mentioned before, there is this literature on parochialism showing that in tougher economic and when competition increases, people become more in-group biased and more out-group hostile. And we're going to look like whether the experience of competition affects those parochialism in the long haul. We use a question in the World Value Survey which asks about whether other groups you don't want to have as neighbors. Now, the last one is immigrants or foreign workers, and I'm going to show you that as well. But the other two are different race or different religion. And when you look at panel A, which is the full sample, you see that it's not just the immigrants, it's actually across the board that like experience a recession or experience different macroeconomic conditions affect those outgroup hostility. If experience income levels go up, you're more likely to be acceptable to somebody from another race, other religion, being your neighbor or not. And most of the effects, again, now when you look at panel A and B, the effects are stronger in the richer country, but it's kind of throughout the board that like if you experience a recession, you're more likely to be outgroup hostile. Now, this is interesting because, first of all, it might say that some of those results on immigration might be not just about immigrants or immigration, but more broadly about outgroup hostility in general. It could also inform that literature that shows that you're mainly against immigrants who don't share your cultural background, and this gives it a different spin on this, that it might come from parochialism, in-group, out-group more generally than just about culture more specifically. So let me summarize and then conclude, and then I'm done, and then we can open it up for discussion. So I think what we want to show and what we hope we show is that growing up in bad macroeconomic times negatively affects attitudes toward immigrants for the rest of your life. Now that of course says that like recessions have like long-term consequences in how people think about immigration going forward. Second, I think support for more pro-social policies during recession that Giuliano and Spilimbergo famously pointed out, it might be less out of increased solidarity and more out of increased self-interest. If you think about this, if you really want to have redistribution for selfish interest, you want to exclude potential recipients of those redistributions. Immigrants who are often poor are like the prime suspect who you want to get out. That shows is like a contribution to that growing and large literature on that redistribution attitudes and immigration attitudes actually go hand in hand. Third, we want to also make this contribution on like parochialism or in-group bias in more general, that we can actually say something about those experiences when young might shape those out-group biases more generally. Tolerance and the lack of parochialism, which also has been shown to be the source of a lot of problems in societies and in countries, is much harder to foster in difficult macroeconomic times, not just current, but also for the long term. So with that, I'm gonna end here. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to a healthy discussion. And if you don't have time or the opportunity to say something here, please send us all comments by email. We would love to get your inputs in how to make this project better.
Thank you very much, Stephan, for this very nice and very clear presentation. I think that we have now much time for question. So I have a couple of people who would like to ask questions. So maybe we can start with Johan. Johan, you had a question or suggestions. Would you like to ask a question?
Hi. Hi. Just a quick follow-up on the. On the discussion we had about whether you can measure immigrant shocks at the national level exclusively or national, regional. I guess with census data, you can maybe look at that, at this variation, and not just national immigrant shocks. And I think it would be interesting. It's more than a question, I guess it's things that I think may be interesting, which is the interactions, right, between the local economic conditions and potential immigrant shocks, right, whether some of the results are shaped by this interaction, whether the two types of questions go in an orthogonal way, or these types of discussion. Just some thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, first of all, thanks so much for like that suggestion. We're gonna have to look at that. And now on the interaction, I think, Robert, I'm sorry for singling you out. You know, we did think about this interaction, you know, high immigrant inflow and recessions, kind of those. Do you want to comment on it, what we thought about it? And maybe we can go back to that.
Yeah, we even thought about a nice label of it now, that the toxic cocktail, right? But yeah, so then I think data limitations made it impossible to study that. Isn't it? Or I'm looking at Maria now. You mentioned before that it was only at the national level now that we have the immigration inflow.
Yeah, so there's an issue of like having enough granularity in the immigration data, which is one thing, and the other thing is having it for a long period of time. So I think we would really like to have this data back to the 1920s. Yeah. And that is quite difficult to find, but then some people in the panel had some nice suggestions, so maybe we can.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a great idea, Joan. So, and we're going to look at not just to get the data as a control, but also to, if we can get it, to look at that interaction. That.
Yeah, I mean, if it's possible, it could be like a nice extension or like combination of results.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. So we had also some questions from Martin.
Hi, thank you so much. It's really a nice presentation. I think that my question was partly answered by the other results that you showed, but I'm gonna comment it anyway. So I was thinking that the way you measure attitudes in the first way by asking people whether they think there are too many or immigrants may be interpreted differently. Empathy towards migrants, and you think that when there are too many in a recession, they are gonna struggle and face bad economic conditions. So then even if you are really pro-immigrants, you may think that there should be fewer so that they are better off. But then when with the other results about like having migrants or out-group people nearby, I was pretty convinced. So I was thinking something else is that it would be interesting to see whether these impacts are reinforced by the size of these out-groups where you live, right? So like, again, like talking about the interactions, whether you live surrounded by many migrants today, or whether if you are white and you are surrounded by, live in a community with more Black people, whether these effects, or more minority people, whether these effects would be reinforced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Martin. Well, that's definitely something we can look at. You know, if it's like data right now, I mean, there is like, of course, a lot of data, and like that we can, at least for the GSS, you know, in what the first wave was 94. I mean, there is very good data, I think, where we could look at where you live. On the, at least those regions, there are only 9 regions in the US. But we can do that on the regional level. Maria?
Yeah, and I was going to say that also with the World Value Survey, where we actually have these questions about living next to people of a different race, perhaps we could try to find some kind of demographics ratio at the country level. I mean, this is obviously very coarse, and it doesn't tell you how much people interact with this with these minorities, but it might be something we could look at in that direction.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Minor question, Stephan. Sorry. So the question was related to internal migration in the US. So what is the share of your sample that has moved between the age 16 and the time of the survey? So we're thinking about the fact that you could take people that are at the time of the survey located in the same state, so exposed to the same environment, but who happen to be located in different states or different regions earlier on in their lives, and compare their attitudes. So they are in the same environment right now, they face the same incentives and constraints, but they were exposed to different macroeconomic conditions back in time. Have you tried doing so on this subsample?
Mm-hmm. We did, no, Maria? That's not the movers and non-movers, or?
Yeah, so I think to answer your question, I think in our sample, a lot of something like 80% or so of our sample lives in the same state at the time of the survey as they did when they were 16. So that's quite reassuring to us when it comes to mobility. But we did try to look what happens if we only look at those who never moved or those who moved as well. And so then we find similar results in both.
Now, Simona, of course, like, you know, there is a limitation in the data. It could be that you grew up in, you know, you're 16 and you're in Kansas, and then you go for a couple of years college and to work in New York City, and then when I survey you and you're 50, you're back in Kansas. We don't capture those. Those would be a person like that would be a non-mover for us. Could be that person actually moved quite dramatically, and especially to urban, you know, to an urban, more diverse place. So that we can't.
Okay.
We'll look at. I mean, we probably could. I mean, we control for whether they had college education. We can probably look at you don't went for college, which is a main reason to move in the US. So we can probably look at that a little bit more specifically. So
yeah, I guess that. I guess that one of the concerns was the selective out-migration during these impressionable years, especially if you are in a region that is hit by bad macroeconomic conditions, you are more likely maybe to immigrate from that region. So this is, I think, the concern that some people have, especially because during these years, these are the typical age brackets during which mobility is the highest.
Yeah, so with the GSS data for the US, this may be a real concern. With the World Value Survey, maybe it's less of a concern because people are less mobile across countries. But yeah, within the US, definitely that may be a concern. Yeah.
Yeah, we should think about how to address this a little bit, or at least discuss it. Great. Mm-hmm.
Oh, there was Javier.
Okay, it's just a question that is related to the previous one. You're assuming in your hypothesis of impressionable years that attitudes will not change after you're 25. But then, is that really true? I mean, if you have a huge crisis like today's crisis, we are not expecting that our preferences and attitudes will change?
Absolutely. I mean, so I think that's why it's so important to, you know, we control for a bunch of things which are important. So like one is, if you think like, you know, if you're in 94, that's very different than when you get surveyed right now. So we have those year fixed effects who capture hopefully the the attitudes right now, or a general shift. We look at life cycle effects as well. So there are like age effects included, so that we actually compare, because it also shifts, of course, like the older people are different. So we want to really look at somebody who is at the same age, at the same conditions right now, but had a different experience in the past about macroeconomic shocks. So that's why we control. So you're absolutely right, Xavier. Of course, changes, but we capture, if that's like, your education level goes up, your age changes, the contemporary time changes as well. We control that all away, or try at least, and only look at what is the effect on the macroeconomic conditions when you grew up. Turns out that experience that you had there and how that affects your attitudes is actually not changing later in life. That doesn't say that older people are different. It's still possible that, like, I'm sure there is a life cycle effect as well. So like older people are different than young people. But we want to say that impression or that imprinting that you got when you were 18 to 25 is actually very constant over the life cycle. So it's not that once you're further away from 25, the effect gets smaller and smaller, how that period affects you. But of course, you're right that it changes. But our specification tries, at least, and we hope, correct you if we're wrong, but we are trying to control very carefully about that, all that changes that happens, you're earning more money, you're whatever, that changes, of course, the attitudes, but we're controlling for all those and just look at those experiences.
Yeah, and I was going to make a complementary point actually to Stephan's, to the idea that is it really these 18-25 years that matter that much? And so in the paper, we really want to accommodate the possibility that it could be that experiences in other groups of years are the ones that really matter, that really going to shape this immigration attitudes. And we look at different intervals, right? We also look at 0 to 7. We also look at, 26 to 30 something. And we find that it is really indeed in line with the literature that this 18-25 do seem to matter more compared to all the other age groups. So this is just a small complementary point to what Stephan already said.
Thank you, Maria. There was a question from someone who stayed anonymous. Mechanism. Do you have any clue about the mechanism behind that result? Maybe a difficult question.
Well, so that maybe Robert and Maria can jump in, but I think like what I think, at least, like the mechanism, there are like two faults of mechanism. One is like through that, if you really want to, like you get hit by a recession, you're doing poorly and your family is doing poorly. You want to kind of restate your position in the income distribution, or you think about this. Now, in order to do that, you have to do two things. One is getting more government transfer. I think that then leads to this more redistribute. You're in favor of more redistribution. But in order to actually affect your position in the income distribution, you need to make sure that people who potentially are poorer than you are not coming in the country. So that then affects the immigration attitudes, that you want to keep those out. I think the second channel is slightly different and goes through those attitudes to like parochialism. We kind of know that people are hardwired to think about groups, and part of what those competitions doing, and I have a bunch of papers, and I'm not the only one, we show that in competition, people start to really care about their own group and be very against other groups. Now, immigrants are a very salient other group. Turns out it's not just immigrants, it's, people of different religion and race, and I'm sure it's like along many other dimensions that I don't share the identity with the other groups. So that's kind of the second mechanism, which is a much more psychological or even evolutionary mechanism that leads to like you want to be against others. But maybe Robert and Maria have like other views on or additional thoughts about this.
I completely agree with what you said. So some people, they have all the luck, so they enter the labor market when the economy is booming, and so they manage to secure a good job that is well paid and that's also in line with their job preferences. And then they tend, as the paper by Giuliano and Spilimbergo shows, then they also tend to think that redistribution policies are not really necessary, And so they seemed like less compassionate. Whereas people who entered the labor market during recessions, they struggled in finding a job. And they then, for the rest of their life, they tend to prefer more redistribution. But what our paper now shows is that, at the same time, these people who struggle when they enter the labor market, they are also like really experiencing this competition also with immigrants, which then imprints on them like a particular attitude towards immigration, even if later on, because those initial conditions, they do have an effect for a long time, but after 10 or 15 years, there's no difference anymore. But yet this effect on preferences and attitudes persists.
Thank you, Robert. Are there still other questions? I don't see any question on the chat. Simone, maybe?
I think that there's a question by Limura.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephan. No, actually, I had a suggestion more than a question. I think it will be, these attitudes data are always questionable in terms of what they pick up. And I think that in your case, you could also rely on more behavioral outcomes, like, for example, marriage. In the marriage market, do these people that experience recession, are they less or more likely, should be less likely to get married with an immigrant or a person from a different race? And I think that will also allow you to look at the dynamic. So when do they do that? Is it like a couple of years after the recession, or is there accumulated effects? You can do, I think, many things using basically the time of and date of the marriage. And also a related outcome is, I think you were mentioning that before, is location choice. So you basically may end up less likely to decide to live close to more diverse neighborhoods if you dislike immigrants. So that could be also an outcome interesting to look at.
Perfect. I mean, that's a great suggestions. We haven't thought about that. I mean, and we were actually thinking a lot about like what our behavioral outcomes are. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
I think there is a paper by Liam Lureris. I can't pronounce his name. He's in Paris School of Economics, and he has a paper on the Journal of Labor Economics where he shows that diversity in the classroom affect basically your chance of getting married with a person from a different race. And he used, I think Simone or someone else can know his name better, can pronounce his name better than I can do. So yeah, that's
we will find it.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks so much.
Okay, we have still two questions coming up. The first one from Jesus, and then Giuseppe De Archangelis. Okay, Jesus, please.
Thanks, Michel. Great paper, Stephan. I really like it. I wanted to ask you regarding the last thing that you presented is, have you checked how far does the group go? Because I mean, when you think about what do you consider this parochial behavior or in-group behavior, do you consider that's going toward your religion? Does it include your family? I wonder whether there are questions in the World Values surveys about your attitudes toward the family, towards extended family, towards your gender. So I would be curious to know how far this identification goes.
Mm-hmm. So far we haven't looked at this, but I think you're absolutely right. And I'm now rephrasing kind of your question a little bit, like, do we also find the opposite, like in-group favoritism? So what is it like somebody from my own race or own religion, or, and both are kind of the same, of the two sides of the same coin. And that might also then allow us to, and we haven't done so, but we should, see like how close do you need to be to that it flips, and on what dimensions. I think that's a great suggestion, Jesus. So, and if somebody knows, what would be a good question to look at in the World Values Survey or in the GSS even, because in the GSS we couldn't find any, but if there is, that would be fantastic for us to know. Robert?
Yeah, we did look at this question, how much you care about the people nearby, isn't it? Or how much you care about helping them. So that's not about family. Nearby is also rather vague, but that may be a question that approaches this. Yeah.
Okay. And last question from Giuseppe.
I was wondering whether a measure of income distribution may be also important in the original residing areas of the people. So basically not only considering the mean, the fact that you are in a recession, but also the area, the sort of Gini coefficient of the residing area, or probably it's much easier for the World Survey where you can have at the country level a measure of income distribution. So it doesn't, not only the mean counts, but also the variability. So the environment where you live is very diverse in terms of income distribution, or is much more homogeneous. There is a difference in suffering a recession in Sweden rather than in other countries where say the US at that time. So whether you can, maybe this can be an additional variable to explore.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So I mean, we only looked so far about like the variance, but we haven't looked at like, you know, what any indicator of inequality or whatever in either the region or like in the country. Thank you, Giuseppe.
Okay, so I think that we are at the end of the seminar. So thank you very much to Stephan and Robert and Maria for presenting and answering these questions. And thank you to everyone for attending the seminar.
Thank you so much for all those great comments, and send more of those.
Okay. You're welcome. Thank you very much for presenting a great paper. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.